Welcome to Bundy Group Insights, where industry expertise meets experience. This podcast is your ultimate guide to the intricate world of mergers and acquisitions, capital raises, and economic trends. Let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of BG Insights. I am Alex Chausovsky, the Director of Analytics and Consulting at the Bundy Group. And today I have the privilege of hosting Eugene Chausovsky, who happens to be my brother, but more importantly is the geopolitical analyst that I turn to when I want to try and understand what the heck's going on in the world. So Eugene, welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure.
Well, I think it'd be very helpful for everyone if you can talk to them a little bit about what you do kind of day to day and the organization that you work with. Can you start us off with a bit of an intro?
Sure. So I'm Senior Director for Analytical Development at Newlines Institute, which is a foreign policy, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. We look at primarily U.S. foreign policy all over the world. The team that I lead focuses on geopolitical analysis and forecasting. So looking at, all of the craziness that's going on all over the world, but looking at it from a very, objective and forward-looking perspective in order to try to understand not only what's happening now, but where things are going. So whether we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the trade war between U.S. and China, conflicts in the Middle East, looking at those from a forecasting perspective, and also trying to tease out the implications of those geopolitical forecasts, whether that be economic implications, humanitarian implications, business implications, things of that nature. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
So safe to say you've been a little busy lately, wouldn't you agree?
Never a dull day.
I'll bet. Well, you talk about being objective in your assessment, and I think that's a great place for us to start. The world is obviously changing at a very rapid pace. The geopolitical landscape is changing. Can you tell us a little bit about your own observations about how that landscape looks today versus what it looked like in the past, and talk about the implications of that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I think if we're just looking from a global themes or trends perspective, there's a couple that I would mention that I think are relevant to what's going on in the day-to-day. So one is that we are in a multipolar world. And what I mean by that is that this kind of is distinct from the bipolar world of the Cold War, where it was, the US, the Soviet Union, and most, if not all of the world aligned in some way with one of those two blocks. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, we entered what was essentially a unipolar world, where it was the U.S. was the predominant power, across the economic, political, security spheres, and that lasted for right up until about, I would say, a decade or so ago. And now we're in a multipolar world where you have multiple powers, multiple players. I think the U.S. is still, the strongest power, collectively speaking. Around the world, but you also have the rise of peer competitors like China. You have, Russia, which is not nearly to that level, but they are playing around in different parts of the world. The Europeans, the EU, which up until recently was a tested and a true ally of the U.S. Now that's being somewhat challenged. And then you have a whole host of regional players, be that India, Japan, Turkey, countries in Latin America like Mexico and Brazil, which are influential, at least in their immediate neighborhoods. And then no less important are non-aligned and non-state actors. So whether that's, Elon Musk, whether that's, countries that don't quite fit into any of those paradigms, we have a lot of different actors, that are influencing the shape of the world. And because of things like advances in technology, what starts locally can easily ripple out globally. And I think we've seen that, from those conflicts that I've mentioned, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East, this can have global implications on energy flows, on shipping flows, things of that nature. And that really brings me to the second kind of broader theme, which is, how these global supply lines have been shifting. So I think that's most clearly seen, as of this week and over the last couple of months with a lot of these tariffs and trade restrictions. We're seeing the global supply chain evolve, a sort of deglobalization shifts in those supply lines, everything from goods to technology to energy, critical minerals being restricted or at least being shaped by all of these different powers. So lots going on. That's why the world is, never a boring place, and certainly not recently. So those are some of the key themes that I look at.
Yeah, fascinating. So, especially top of mind with Liberation Day happening yesterday, with President Trump obviously announcing a whole slew of reciprocal tariff actions, as the administration is calling them, against every country that we trade with a baseline tariff of 10%, but then going up from there depending on what they charge us from a variety of perspectives, rather, whether it's a tariff itself or VAT, or some other means of blocking the entry of American products into the country. Talk a little bit about what your view is on the effects of that type of behavior by the U.S. administration and the implications to our relationships with the countries that we engage with, and particularly to the some of the themes that you talked about. How will it impact that, both short term, medium term, and longer term as well?
Right. So I think, one of the biggest trends, and this is sort of implicit in all the things that we talked about, is this change in the US administration and all of the domestic and foreign policy implications that we've seen, quite a lot, honestly, over the last couple of months. And the tariffs and trade element is a huge part of that, obviously. So basically, right now we're in a place where the US is basically trying, under the Trump administration, to redraw the rules of trade, essentially. That has multiple motivations, obviously wanting to get more of those revenues back into the US to address our trade deficit, to level the playing field, so to speak, and to use it as a negotiating tool. I think it was quite interesting, actually, in this announcement that you had this sort of universal, 10% tariffs applied to all countries, including some countries that thought they might get exemptions, by offering sweeteners to the US, countries like Japan, India, things of that nature. Nope, applies to everybody. But then the kind of the selective tariffs, the reciprocal element, is kind of meant to address those trade imbalances, and in particular the trade deficit. So you see the countries that have the highest kind of, that the US has the highest deficit with, had the highest targets, and that applied to to allies and to adversaries alike. So whether you're China or whether you're Taiwan, that's an element that's clearly impacting. So it's a very kind of America first, economic driven strategy, but one that has a whole host of geopolitical implications and connotations. I'm sure we'll get into that when we get more into these different hotspots, but that's kind of the broader backdrop that I would describe this this latest round of tariffs in.
Yeah, so tariffs as a geopolitical negotiating tool, that's a relatively new concept, right? We didn't see President Trump do that very much during his first term, but he's clearly taking a very strong approach in that direction during his second term. What are some of the risks that you see, unfolding as part of this? Because, when you talk about tariffs with closely knit allied countries like Mexico and Canada versus tariffs on places like China, right? Or some other adversary that we might have around the world, there are very different implications and very different potential risks, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about, from a geopolitical perspective, what is the risk of being this aggressive in terms of tariffs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, this, one of the risks I would say is to accelerate a process that's already underway, that we've already mentioned, which is this kind of multipolar world where it's not just one major power or even two major powers, but you have a number of different countries that act, independently or autonomously. So if you're talking about countries like, you mentioned Canada and Mexico, I would also throw in the Europeans there, even to some extent some of the Asian allies of the US. They're going to have to reconsider, the relationship with the US. That doesn't mean they all of a sudden turn from allies to adversaries, right? But that they will have to sort of re-examine their own foreign policy from their own kind of strategic interests. Every country has them, right? So whether it's Canada, turning to the European market more so than it had before, when it was very overwhelmingly reliant on the U.S. market, right? Or whether it's, we just saw this week leading up to the tariff announcement, China meeting with Japan and South Korea, and discussing ways, not only economic cooperation, but ways to mitigate or kind of coordinate on their tariff response. I mean, there's no love lost between these countries. I don't think Japan and Korea are going to become, Chinese allies or anything like that, but they have to act pragmatically, right? And these countries that are very exposed economically to the U.S. So basically, the risk here is that countries that the U.S. could rely on. I don't want to say no matter what, but that were either treaty allies or largely aligned on all matters, whether that be economic or security, um, are going to have to hedge their bets a little bit, right? And that could play out in different ways. I think we're starting to see only the beginning of that. That will obviously depend on how these trade restrictions actually manifest themselves, because I think there will still be a negotiating process, right? I think tariffs are used both as a tool for negotiations, but also a punitive measure or a measure to bring some of that economic activity back to the U.S. So a lot of different things in play. There are risks there. There are also opportunities. I think some countries, we've even seen Israel, for example, say, okay, no more tariffs with the U.S. as a result of this. This happened about 24 hours before the announcement. So I think there will be some benefits and some of those relationships will stay quite strong, and perhaps it could be mutually beneficial. But some could, like I said, choose to hedge their bets a little bit more.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. There is no one template that will fit every situation and every relationship that the US has. I think that the initial reaction of the world was very much freak out, but we're going to see how the dust settles after a few weeks or a couple of months of time and where the negotiations land us. Obviously, major potential implications for not only the US, but the global economy as well. So it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. Well, I appreciate your perspective because you have a way to kind of take the emotional element out of that. Let's apply the same to kind of the hotspots, the different theaters around the world where a lot of eyeballs are drawn to. And I'm thinking of the top three, obviously, the Russia Ukraine conflict, what's been going on in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, but also in a broader context with Hezbollah and Iran. And then, of course, the Indo-Pacific theater, where we're talking about the China-Taiwan tensions, but also the broader regional implications. Talk to me a little bit about kind of what you track and what your methodology is, and then what the expectations are based on that proven methodology that you have at Newlines in terms of what is the likeliest outcome in 2025 for each one of those theaters.
Sure. So yeah, broadly speaking, we're looking at these different theaters from different kind of thematic or sectoral perspectives. So, geopolitics, the three key sort of pillars of geopolitics, obviously you have the political element, but also economic and security. And you can add diplomatic as either a subset of the political or in its own right. So we look at various forecast scenarios for each of those hotspots, if you will. And those can start out broad and can get obviously much more specific. We look at things like military escalation, hybrid escalation, meaning anything that's non-kinetic in form. That can include cyber attacks, that can include trade restrictions, sanctions, things of that nature, intelligence operations. And then you have diplomatic de-escalation if something is actually trending towards, in a more positive way, whether it's a conflict that's de-escalating or whether it's, trade tensions themselves, which will be a recurring theme here, de-escalating. So if you're looking as an example of this for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we're always tracking against those broad scenarios with different sub scenarios, within that. And I would say right now, at the point that we're at, we're forecasting, or we have forecasted at Newlines for 2025, that this conflict was, broadly speaking, very much trending towards diplomatic de-escalation, meaning where we were at the end of 2024 and where we expect to be, by the end of this year, and perhaps much earlier than that, is that the military component of the Russia-Ukraine conflict would certainly slow down, if not, cease entirely. We've seen already a lot of diplomatic activity in terms of ceasefire negotiations, things of that nature, and direct U.S.-Russia talks, which have happened for the first time in over, basically since the full-scale invasion started 3 years ago. So that's where things are trending in Russia-Ukraine. Although it's quite interesting that just this past week, we saw how the hybrid escalation element was really introduced into this conflict with the U.S., whether it's Trump himself or even members of the Senate, floating out that if Russia is not going to be cooperative in these negotiations that the Trump administration has really spearheaded, that Russia could see significant restrictions, including anywhere from 25 to, it was floated to 500% of countries that Russia sells oil to, for example, would be subject to tariffs from the U.S. Russia's already heavily sanctioned by the U.S., by the Europeans. There's been some negotiations to ease those sanctions, but that's contingent upon that diplomatic de-escalation, right? So I still think we're trending very much in that direction on the diplomatic side, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some flare-ups, over the course of the year and certainly over the next few months in terms of that hybrid element. That's important because this has, implications for the global energy supplies. Russia obviously being a major, oil and gas exporter. We saw how the conflict early on impacted grain supplies, both from Russia and Ukraine. So these geopolitical trends can certainly have economic and business implications, either in a disruptive sense, or if we do see that diplomatic de-escalation play out, that can unlock a lot of activity, in energy, in grain, and really it just kind of broader trade flows between the U.S., Russia, and many other countries.
Right. And how about the Middle East? What do you see going on there?
So Middle East right now, we're definitely trending heavily towards military escalation, at least in the short term. We saw a lot of diplomatic activity leading up to this year, with the ceasefire agreement that was finally reached between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, with the ceasefire in Lebanon. Syria saw a very significant change there. But more recently, we've seen a lot of that be tested, if not breaking entirely. There's multiple motivations for that, but one of those being that Iran is still very much supporting a lot of those proxy groups, whether that be Hamas, whether that be Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. We've seen, by the way, another major economic implication of this: global shipping through the Red Sea has been drastically reduced as a result of attacks on international shipping. So what we've seen recently, and I think it's very important to pay attention to this, is that the Trump administration has basically had a carrot and stick approach, not unlike its strategy in a lot of theaters in regard to Iran, which is that open the door to negotiations, in particular over Iran's nuclear program, which we've seen. But also, if those negotiations don't go anywhere or if Iran rejects them, we've seen some pretty significant signals out of potential military escalation against Iran, whether that be from the US directly or Israel or a combination of the two. That would obviously have significant implications, again, on things like energy and shipping. So really, I think we're approaching a fork in the road there. So don't be surprised if in the next few months, hopefully we can avoid this, but I'm just saying from an objective forecasting perspective, I think military escalation, not just in those theaters like in Gaza and in Lebanon, but between the US and Iran is on the table. And we've seen some signaling from the US on that. So, pay close attention to that and everything that could entail.
Yeah, there's not enough going on. Why don't we attack Iran also to throw a little twist in there, see how the world reacts to that. Great. And then, of course, the big one, strategically, from a timeline perspective, the Indo-Pacific. What do you see going on between China, Taiwan? How does the U.S. fit into all of that? And what is your expectation in terms of developments for the rest of this year?
Yeah, this is the big one. I mean, this is the one theater that's not in an active military phase, right? But it has the most implications if it were to reach that level. And so, yeah, we're tracking very closely what's going on around China and Taiwan. Even just this past week, China held some pretty major military exercises there. And, but that's something that I think is going to be largely limited despite these kinds of, shows of force by China. I think really that's more of a pressure tactic. The hybrid escalation element is where I would really point to from a forecast scenario for this theater, whether that be between the US and China directly, first and foremost, but we're seeing, trade restrictions and all that kind of stuff spill over into many countries in the Indo-Pacific. We already talked about Japan, South Korea, even Southeast Asian countries were highly targeted, countries like Vietnam, by these tariffs, for example. So if we see that continue to escalate, which I believe that we will, we are going to have to pay attention to what China will do in response. Now, yes, they can do exercises around Taiwan. They can play around in the South China Sea. I think what is really important to pay attention to is China, manipulating supply chains and restricting trade in its own right. I've always pointed to critical minerals as a really important component of this. This is something that China has not just a lot of production, but in particular refining capabilities. It has monopolies across a lot of different minerals, whether that be lithium or cobalt or especially rare earth elements. If we start to see China restrict, those types of supplies, that could have tremendous implications on everything from EVs to solar and wind to consumer electronics, right? So we've seen over the past few years, and this by the way is a bipartisan issue, something started by Trump, continued by the Biden administration, and then accelerated further by this Trump administration in terms of pressuring China via trade controls, things of that nature. So this is the key element to watch from an economic and business perspective, I think. And this is the highest scenario that I predict for this coming year.
Wow, that's a lot to try to keep tabs on. One of the things that we often help companies do is figure out what are the variety of scenarios that are possible, and then plan accordingly. I know that that's something that you do at Newlines as well, specifically in the geopolitical arena. Can you talk of us very quickly about some of the simulations that you've run and kind of how that could help people really, make those plans that are necessary for whatever outcome is going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with forecasting comes a certain benefit in that if you can anticipate not even exactly what's going to happen, but some realistic scenarios that can allow, whether you're a business, whether you're a humanitarian organization, that can allow you to do your own planning and have contingency plans in place. So we do simulations around some of the key, essentially all of the key hotspots that I've mentioned, and looking at it not just from a war games perspective, which is that you're just kind of simulating what would happen if China were to invade Taiwan, or what were to happen if the U.S. were to bomb Iran. Those are things important to for sure to be aware of, but looking more at kind of the gray zone, the supply chain manipulation, what would happen or to manipulate those critical mineral supplies. For example, what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz, a key maritime energy choke point, what if that was cut off in the way that the Red Sea got cut off, last year, right? So being able to play those things out, not only geopolitically, but also from the economic and business implications, I think is really important. And, I hope it can be valuable for anybody that's interested in doing such a thing.
Absolutely. And what's the website that they can go to check out some more of the Newlines material and the thought leadership content that you provide?
Yeah, it's newlinesinstitute.org. You can check that out. We also have a weekly forecast monitor newsletter that you can sign up for on the website to get weekly tracking of all of those different geopolitical hotspots and forecast scenarios and connectivity implications. So you can find all of that on our website.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eugene. I feel like we could talk for hours on end because there's so much to cover, but we'll wrap it up here. Really appreciate you being on the show and hope to have you back in the near-term future.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Take care, everyone. Have a good one.
Before we conclude, an essential reminder: Bundy Group Securities, LLC, an affiliated entity of Bundy Group, is a registered broker-dealer and a member of FINRA and SIPC. Please note that Bundy Group and Bundy Group Securities do not provide any financial, legal, economic, accounting, investment, or tax advice through this program. Neither Bundy Group nor its affiliates make any representation or warranty regarding the accuracy of the information provided in this content series, and the content provided does not constitute a recommendation. This content should not be copied or published without the expressed written consent of Bundy Group.